This video guide will walk you through key steps to stitch up the trumpet player. So we'll start at the bottom with your shoes. This is quite a good place to start as we're just using a satin stitch, which is one of the most simple stitches. There are separate how-to video guides on all stitches, including satin stitch. You'll find that in the straight stitch video. But you can see here I'm just working in a simple stitch from top to the bottom, filling in the full area of the shoes. I always find it easiest to work from the longest point and then outwards, so you see how I start with the top point of the shoe and then work down. So you can see a close-up in detail here of exactly what I'm doing. Don't worry too much about how close each of the stitches are to each other. Because the fabric's printed, the moment you are a slight distance away from it, you won't notice any gaps because you'll see the orange of the fabric. So you'll continue in this way to fill out the full shoe. I think once you finish the shoe, it's quite nice to add a row of running stitch along the bottom, as I'm doing here. This creates the illusion of the sole of the shoes. And so then we'll move on to the trousers. And using the red thread, we'll use exactly the same approach of taking a satin stitch, fill in these scalloped edges on the trousers. Again, you can see here I start from the centre point of each scallop and work down to the sides, because that's just the easiest way I find it to do. However, you'll find whichever way works best for you. So you can see a bit more detail here, exactly what I'm doing and how I'm filling out these scallops. So once you've fully finished filling in those scallops, we'll go on with the dark pink to add a row of chain stitch on the outside edge. Again, do watch the separate video on chain stitch. Here I'm using the link method. I tend to find that the easiest method to use, but I'd recommend getting a scrap piece of fabric and testing out the link method and the loop method. See whichever you prefer. As we'll end up adding a row of gold stitch between the red and the dark pink, it's good to keep just a little bit of space between the two. So once you've finished that, we'll go on to use the gold thread to add this running stitch down between the two. If you ever find you get a little piece of thread coming up the front like that, Don't worry too much. They'll either go back under when you keep stitching, or at the end you can just get a sharp pair of sewing scissors and snip them off. So whilst you've got the gold thread, I'd add these French knots on the bottom of the shoes. Now French knots are a bit tricky to do when you haven't done them before, so I'd recommend getting a scrap piece of fabric, practice them on. You can always do those gold French knots on the shoes a couple of times till you get one you're happy with. It's quite easy just to cut it off if you aren't happy with it, and make sure the thread is secured at the back. So you can see here, I'll just continue adding in running stitch. So once that's done, we'll go on to do a few more French knots, adding in these polka dots down the trousers. So here you can see I'm wrapping the thread around the needle maybe 3 or 4 times in order to create quite a large French knot. Again, if you have a scrap piece of fabric, you can test out how you find it easiest or neatest. People tend to just make French knots by wrapping the thread once or twice, and so you may find that much easier. You can see in detail here exactly what I'm doing, but there is a separate video on French knots. So once you've fully filled those in, then we'll go on to add in his belt. Now start with the orange thread, and then we'll just be working in a satin stitch from side to side on his belt. By this point you'll be pretty experienced at using satin stitch, having done the trousers and the shoes. So I think you'll find this very straightforward. As you're going to end up edging this with gold, don't worry too much about how neat the edges are. It doesn't matter if it's not perfectly straight lines, because you'll end up adding a line over the top. You can see a close up here exactly of what I'm doing, adding in this gold thread. So once that's done, we'll take exactly the same approach, but with the gold thread adding in the other part of the belt. Now the one thing you'll find is gold thread can sometimes be a little tricky to work with, has a tendency to snag. So just have a bit of patience when you're working through, and just work slowly. You'll find you start getting used to it, the more you do. Whilst you've still got the gold thread, then I'd go on to go add this running stitch down on his belt. You're just literally going to add a running stitch along either side. It will really neaten it all off. And so with that done, then we'll go on to do his jumper and the poncho. So I take first, start adding in these threads, these shapes in a satin stitch, almost like the sunbeam. You'll add another row of edging around this, therefore much like the belt, don't worry if the sides are that neat, because you'll end up going over the top of it in a dark red outline. But you'll just simply fill these in using a satin stitch. As you can see, I fully filled those in there, and now I'm taking the red and adding in a running stitch around the outside outline of his arms. So I'm doing this in reasonably long stitches. You don't see that much of it from when you finish the trumpeter because there's so much detail going on elsewhere. So you can just keep this bit quite simple. And now we're back on to French knots. So we're going to start filling out these edges of the poncho using the French knot. I'm doing each French knot, again with around 3 or 4 times wrapping round. You'll have them all very close to each other, so you don't necessarily see each one individually, and therefore it doesn't matter too much how neat each individual one is. Again, as you can see there, I've got a bit of thread has come up through to the front. I'll just end up trimming that off once I've finished. And so you can see I've done exactly the same approach here on both areas of the poncho and then also at the top of the crown in the light pink. You'll find that bit quite satisfying to do. Quite fun doing that number of French knots. We're almost getting there. Now on the poncho, I'm just going to go in and add these polka dot details on using a satin stitch. I'll start here with the red thread and I'll be doing exactly the same approach with the yellow polka dots on the top section of the poncho. These just add a nice bit of detail. Whilst I have the red thread, I'll go up and also add a chain stitch row around the top of the red section of the poncho here. You'll see later on I've done exactly the same, adding some chain stitch in the yellow edge of the poncho just below. Now throughout this, I like to do the plait right at the end, because then I can put the plait over any existing stitches. So it really feels like it's on top of the poncho. So you'll see here, as I add in the chain stitch, I'll just go straight across where the plait cuts across. You won't be able to see this later when I stitch over the top. So yes, I repeat exactly the same process there. As you can see, I've got the chain stitch down the edges in yellow and the polka dots added in. So now on this section, I'll just show you a bit more detail as to how I'm stitching up the trumpet. I'll show you the full stitching of the trumpet. Now you can stitch it in any way you'd like. Here I take quite a simple approach and try to fill out the key details, not worrying too much about what type of stitch I'm using or how neat it is. You may find it easiest just to watch this and then stitch alongside, stitching your trumpet in the same way, putting the stitches in the same place. If you find it feels too bulky to get the detail you want, then you can always go on to using 2 strands of gold thread rather than the 3. That will help you achieve a bit more detail. However, here I'm just using 3 strands still. Whilst I've got the gold, I'll also go on to stitch the top detail of the crown. And again, I'll show you the full crown being stitched here so you can see in detail how I do it. But I work in a pretty simple way, just creating the long diagonal stretches of the crown first, and then I'll go in to add the detail between the apexes. As you can see here, I'm just adding in the cross between the 2. So the final bit I add in is his hair. The hair, should I say. And this plait, I think, is really fun to stitch. I like to work to bring each section into a point, so that you start to create the volume and it really feels like it's going in and out, like hair. So you see here, I work with the needle coming up through the top, and then all of my stitches go into exactly the same point at the base of this section of the hair. I'll show you this in a close-up so you can really see what's going on. So don't worry about being very generous here with the amount of thread you're using, going over the top of stitches you've previously done. It creates a really nice voluminous effect if you use quite a lot of stitches on top of each other. And then you can also see here how I'm going over that earlier red I stitched in. So you really doesn't matter if you stitch underneath where the plait's coming down, because you'll end up being able to completely cover that with the dark grey for the plait. And so I just can continue in that vein to stitch up the whole of the plait. And that's the finished touch. So with that, you've finished the trumpeter. Get in touch if you have any other questions.